Deep in the eastern Kentucky hollers, where the morning mist clings to ancient ridge lines like the ghosts of forgotten sins, there stands a cabin the local folks won't speak about after dark. The floorboards still creak with the weight of secrets too heavy for any foundation to bear, and if you listen closely on certain nights, when the wind cuts through the pines just right, you can almost hear the echoes of a story so disturbing that 3 generations of mountain families have sworn never to tell it. But tonight, we're going to tell it anyway. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one, traveling through the remote mountains of Appalachia in 1923. A circuit judge stumbled upon court records that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Buried in a stack of yellowed documents was the case file of Delila May Whitlock, a woman whose story had been deliberately buried by a community too ashamed to acknowledge what had happened within their own bloodlines. What that judge discovered wasn't just a tale of family dysfunction. It was a nightmare that revealed the darkest corners of human nature when civilization's watchful eye turns away. This isn't a story about poverty or isolation, though both played their roles. This isn't even a story about mental illness, though madness certainly crept through the Blackwood family tree like poison through mountain water. No, this is something far more disturbing. A chronicle of how tradition, silence, and twisted loyalty can transform a family into something that barely resembles humanity at all. The locals called her Devil's Daughter, though never to her face. They whispered that she carried the mark of her sins in her eyes, one blue, one green, like God couldn't decide whether to bless or curse her. But the truth about Delila May Blackwood runs deeper than superstition. It runs deeper than shame. It runs all the way down to the bedrock of what happens when a family decides that their bloodline is more sacred than the laws of God and nature. Combined, what you're about to hear has been pieced together from court documents, diary entries, and the testimonies of those brave enough to break decades of silence. Some of these details have never been made public. Some probably shouldn't be, but the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deep you bury it. The Blackwood family had been scratching out a living in the Kentucky mountains since before the Civil War, when the first Josiah Blackwood claimed a patch of rocky ground that nobody else wanted. They were what mountain folk called ridge runners. Families so isolated that the outside world might as well have been another planet. No. Mail came up there, hollow. No. Preacher made the treacherous climb to their door, and that's exactly how old Josiah preferred it. By 1890, the Blackwood homestead had grown into a small compound of rough-hewn cabins connected by covered walkways, like a fortress designed to keep the world out and the family secrets in. Josiah's son, Ezekiel, had inherited more than just his father's land. He'd inherited his paranoia, his contempt for outsiders, and his unshakable belief that the Blackwood bloodline was somehow special, chosen, set apart from the common rabble down in the valleys. It was Ezekiel who first began preaching what he called the pure doctrine to his children. He'd gather them around the fire on winter nights and tell them that God had blessed the Blackwoods with superior blood, that mixing with outsiders would dilute their divine essence, that their family was like the biblical patriarchs who married within their own tribes to keep the bloodline sacred. The children listened with wide eyes as their father quoted twisted interpretations of Scripture, weaving together fragments of Genesis and Leviticus into a doctrine that would have made any real preacher sick to his stomach. But it was Ezekiel's daughter, young Mary Catherine, who truly believed. She absorbed her father's teachings like dry earth drinks rain, and by the time she was 16, she was already helping him spread the pure doctrine to her younger siblings. When Mary Catherine married her first cousin, Jeremiah Blackwood, in a ceremony performed by her own father, Bain, and their family chapel. The mountain community barely raised an eyebrow. Cousin marriages weren't uncommon in those isolated hollers. After all, what they didn't know was that this marriage was just the beginning. Mary Catherine had already been pregnant twice by her father before she married Jeremiah. Pregnancies that ended in stillbirths that the family buried in unmarked graves behind the main cabin. And when she finally bore a living child in 1891, a daughter they named Delila May, the entire family celebrated the birth as a sign of God's approval for their pure doctrine. But Delila May Blackwood was born into a world where the definitions of family, love, and duty had been so twisted that she would never know where one ended and the others began. Delila May's childhood was a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as religious devotion. From the moment she could walk, her grandfather Ezekiel would take her by the hand each morning and lead her to the family chapel, a converted storage room where handwritten scripture covered every inch of the walls, verses carefully selected and edited to support the Blackwood doctrine of blood purity. She learned to read using her grandfather's annotated Bible where entire passages had been crossed out and rewritten in his spidery handwriting. By age 7, Delila May could recite from memory the twisted genealogies that Ezekiel claimed proved their divine heritage. She knew that Abraham married his half-sister Sarah, that Jacob married 2 sisters, that the sons of Adam must have married their own sisters to populate the earth. What she didn't know was that normal families didn't gather in circles every evening to discuss the spiritual benefits of keeping bloodlines uncorrupted by outsider poison. Her mother, Mary Catherine, had by this time become something between a religious fanatic and a broken shell of a woman. She spent her days in a constant state of nervous energy, always cooking, always cleaning, always preparing for the next family ceremony or ritual. She spoke to Delila May in the cadence of biblical prophecy, calling her the chosen vessel and the pure seed of the covenant. When Delila May asked why she looked different from the children she occasionally glimpsed in the valley below, why her eyes were 2 different colors, why her left hand was slightly malformed, her mother would clutch her clothes and whisper that these were signs of God's special favor. The truth was far more sinister. Delila May's distinctive features weren't marks of divine blessing. They were the physical manifestations of generations of inbreeding, genetic abnormalities. The AT would have sent any doctor running for help, but there were no doctors in the Blackwood compound. There was only family and family doctrine, and the growing certainty that Delila May was being groomed for something that went far beyond normal religious instruction. When she turned 13, the nature of her education began to change. Ezekiel started teaching her about the sacred duty that awaited her, the role she would play in keeping the Blackwood bloodline pure for another generation. He spoke in biblical metaphors and cryptic references, but the message was becoming clear. Delila May wasn't just a member of the family. She was its future, and that future required sacrifices that would make Abraham's willingness to kill Isaac look like child's play. The mountain winter of 1904 would be the last time anyone saw Delila May smile. What happened to Delila May during the winter of 1905 can only be pieced together from fragments. A torn diary page found years later stuffed between floorboards. Testimony from her younger brother who finally broke his silence decades later, and the chilling court records that would eventually surface. But the picture that emerges is one of systematic grooming disguised as spiritual awakening of a 13-year-old girl being prepared for horrors that her isolated upbringing had taught her to accept as divine will. Ezekiel had begun holding private covenant ceremonies with Delila May, rituals that took place in the root cellar beneath the main cabin where the family kept their winter stores. He told her these Sessions were necessary to prepare her for her sacred role as the vessel of the pure bloodline. The ceremonies started with hours of prayer and fasting, followed by readings from the carefully edited scriptures that emphasized the spiritual importance of family unity. Then came the physical purification, rituals that Ezekiel claimed were modeled after Old Testament practices. Delila May's mother, Mary Catherine, not only knew about these ceremonies, but actively participated in preparing her daughter for them. She would dress Delila May in white robes that she had sewn by hand, anoint her with oils made from mountain herbs, and whisper encouragement about the holy purpose she was fulfilling. In Mary Catherine's fractured mind, she wasn't delivering her daughter to abuse. She was presenting her as a sacred offering to preserve their blessed bloodline. The psychological manipulation was as devastating as any physical harm. Delila May was told that resistance would anger God, that doubt was a sign of spiritual impurity, that her discomfort was simply her mortal flesh rebelling against divine purpose. When she cried, she was told that tears were prayers. When she tried to refuse, she was reminded of biblical women who had suffered for the greater good of their people. Every normal human reaction was reframed as either weakness to be overcome or holiness to be embraced. By spring of 1905, the damage was done. Delila May had been transformed from a curious, spirited child into something resembling a sleepwalker, present in body, but absent in spirit, going through the motions of daily life, while some essential part of her had retreated so deep inside that it might never surface again. Her grandfather proclaimed this change as evidence of her spiritual maturity, her acceptance of God's plan for the Blackwood family. But Ezekiel's plan was just beginning. The ceremonies in the root cellar had been preparation. What came next would ensure that Delila May could never escape, never tell, never find her way back to the person she might have been in the summer of 1906. When Delila May was 15, the Blackwood family held what they called the Great Covenant Ceremony. 4 weeks beforehand, Mary Catherine had been preparing special foods and decorating the family chapel with wildflowers and hand-carved symbols that Ezekiel claimed were ancient Hebrew marks of blessing. To any outside observer, it might have looked like preparation for a wedding in the twisted logic of the Blackwood Doctrine. That's exactly what it was. The ceremony took place on the night of the summer solstice with only the immediate family present. Ezekiel presided, wearing robes that Mary Catherine had sewn from black wool, while Delila May stood before him in the same white dress she had worn during her purification rituals. Her younger siblings, 3 brothers and 2 sisters, all born from the union between Mary Catherine and her own father, watched from the shadows as their grandfather spoke about the sacred duty of bloodline preservation. But this wasn't just religious theater. This was the moment when Ezekiel formalized what had already been happening for months. In front of his assembled family, he declared Delila May to be his covenant wife, bound by divine law to bear children who would carry the pure Blackwood bloodline into the next generation. He quoted fabricated scripture about the spiritual power of multigenerational unions, about how the prophets of old had practiced similar sacred marriages to maintain their connection to God. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Delila May stood through the entire ceremony like a statue, her mismatched eyes staring at something beyond the candlelit chapel walls. When it came time for her to speak, the vows that Ezekiel had written for her, she recited them in a voice so hollow it might in that had been coming from the bottom of a well. The words were about duty and purity and sacred purpose, but they might as well have been a death sentence. By October of that same year, Delila May was pregnant with her first child, a pregnancy that the family celebrated as proof of God's approval for their practices. When she gave birth to a son in the spring of 1907, They named him Ezekiel Jr. after his father and grandfather, who were the same person. The boy was born with severe physical deformities that the family interpreted as marks of divine favor, but which any medical professional would have recognized as the tragic consequences of extreme inbreeding. This was just the beginning. Over the next 8 years, Delila May would give birth to 6 more children. The Blackwood compound during those years became something that defied description. Part nursery, part asylum, part monument to human depravity. Delila May's children, all fathered by her own grandfather, bore the devastating genetic consequences of generations of inbreeding. Some were born blind, others couldn't walk or speak properly. One daughter, born in 1910, had such severe developmental disabilities that she never progressed beyond the mental capacity of a toddler, though she lived to be nearly 30 years old. But Ezekiel saw these deformities as signs of divine blessing, proof that his family had achieved a level of spiritual purity that transcended earthly concerns about health, and normally, he would hold each newborn up to the light streaming through the chapel windows and declare them angels sent by God to bless the pure bloodline. The more severe their disabilities, the more convinced he became that they were touched by the divine. Delila May herself had become something barely recognizable as human. Years of pregnancies, trauma, and psychological manipulation had transformed her into a hollow-eyed caretaker who moved through her days like a ghost. She rarely spoke, except to murmur biblical phrases that her grandfather had drilled into her. When she did interact with her children, it was with the mechanical tenderness of someone going through the motions of motherhood, while her soul had fled to some unreachable place. The other family members had fallen into their own patterns of dysfunction. Mary Catherine spent her days cooking enormous meals for the ever-growing household while muttering prayers under her breath. Delila May's younger siblings, her uncles and aunts, who were also her brothers and sisters, had been so warped by their upbringing that they saw nothing abnormal about their family structure. Some of them had begun forming their own inappropriate relationships within the compound, creating an even more tangled web of genetic disaster. By 1915, there were 17 people living in the Blackwood compound, and nearly all of them shared DNA in ways that nature never intended. The isolation that had once protected their secrets was now trapping them in a spiral of genetic and psychological destruction that grew worse with each generation. Ezekiel, now in his 70s, had begun talking about preparing the next generation of covenant wives from among his own granddaughters. But the outside world was beginning to take notice. Modern roads were creeping closer to the mountain hollers. Government officials were starting to ask questions about families who never appeared in census records, and in 1917, a forest ranger hiking through the area would stumble upon evidence that would finally crack open the Blackwood family's terrible secret. Forest ranger Thomas Mitchell was tracking a wounded deer through the dense Kentucky wilderness when he first caught sight of smoke rising from what his map showed as uninhabited territory. Following the thin gray line through the trees, he discovered the Blackwood compound, a cluster of ramshackle buildings that looked like they had been forgotten by time itself. What he witnessed there would haunt him for the rest of his life, and eventually lead to one of the most disturbing court cases in Appalachian history. Mitchell's initial report, preserved in the Kentucky State Archives, describes a scene that seemed to come from another century. Children with obvious physical deformities wandered the compound like lost spirits, many of them unable to speak coherently or care for themselves. The adults moved with the shuffling gait of people who had never learned to interact with the outside world, and at the center of it all was Delila May, now 26 years old, but looking decades older, surrounded by children who called her both mama and sister, because in their twisted family tree, she was both. The investigation that followed Mitchell's report took nearly 2 years to complete, partly because authorities struggled to untangle the web of relationships that had developed over 3 generations of inbreeding. When the truth finally emerged in court documents, even hardened law enforcement officials were sickened by what they discovered. Ezekiel Blackwood had not only abused his own daughter and granddaughter, but had created an entire ideology to justify and perpetuate these crimes across multiple generations. Ezekiel himself died in custody before he could stand trial, taking many of the family's darkest secrets with him to his grave. Delila May was removed from the compound along with her children and placed in state care, but the damage was already done. She never fully recovered her ability to function in normal society, spending her remaining years in a psychiatric facility where she would sometimes speak in the biblical cadences that her grandfather had drilled into her decades earlier. The Blackwood compound was burned to the ground by court order in 1920, but the legacy of what happened there lingered like smoke in the mountain air. Local families still whisper about the devil's daughter on quiet nights, though most of them have forgotten that Delila May was not the source of evil. She was its victim. The story of the Blackwood family serves as a reminder that the most horrifying monsters are often those who wrap their cruelty in the language of divine purpose, who use isolation and twisted doctrine to justify the unjustifiable. In the deep mountains of Appalachia, where civilization's reach grows thin, some secrets are buried so deep that they take generations to claw their way back to the surface, but they always do. Truth has a way of surviving even when everything else turns to ash. The ashes of the Blackwood compound settled into the mountain soil, and for a while, the hollow was quiet. The state believed it had contained the nightmare, scattering the surviving children to various institutions and foster homes, hoping to bury the story with the rubble. But a legacy woven from 3 generations of twisted doctrine and shared blood does not simply vanish with the scent of smoke. It sleeps, and in its sleep, it waits. The children of Delila May, now wards of the Commonwealth, were puzzles the system was unequipped to solve. They were not merely orphaned or abandoned. They were refugees from a reality so closed and self-referential that the outside world was a terrifying, senseless bombardment. They spoke in a patois of Appalachian English and biblical verse, flinching at the touch of strangers, and viewed simple acts of kindness with deep, theological suspicion. The pure doctrine, etched into their minds before they could even form memories, had become the unshakable foundation of their identities. Ezekiel Jr., the firstborn son, was placed in a boys' home in Lexington. Though his body was frail and his vision poor, he carried his grandfather's fire. He didn't see his physical limitations as flaws, but as the marks of a covenant that the outside world was too blind to understand. He would whisper the old scriptures to the other boys at night. Not the sanitized versions from the home's chapel Bibles, but the twisted genealogies and purity laws his grandfather had written on his soul. He tried to explain to a bewildered social worker that his mother was also his sister, and that this was the highest form of spiritual order, not a sin. He was deemed delusional and transferred to a more secure facility, where his fervor only calcified into a colder, harder certainty. Meanwhile, a younger sister, whom the family had named Ruth, was placed with a childless couple in a small farming community. They were good, simple people who saw a quiet, malnourished girl and believed love could cure anything. They didn't understand that her silence wasn't trauma in the way they knew it. It was a fortress. She watched their normal life, their bickering, their affection, their casual faith as if observing animals in a strange new forest. She remembered her grandfather's words, that outsider love was a poison, a sweet-tasting lie designed to dilute their sacred purpose. When her foster mother tried to hug her, Ruth would stand rigid, her mind echoing with her mother Mary Catherine's whispers about the unclean touch of those beyond the bloodline. The outside world in its attempt to heal them, only succeeded in proving Ezekiel Blackwood's original prophecy correct. The world was a corrupting, dangerous place. Its interventions felt like violations. Its compassion felt like coercion. The pure doctrine, born in isolation, was now being tempered and reinforced by the very system meant to dismantle it. The story should end here, with a slow, quiet fading. But in the 1950s, a curious pattern emerged in state records. A pattern a genealogist would later call the Blackwood Echo. Several of Delila May's children, once they aged out of state care, vanished from official view. They did not marry, or if they did, the marriages were short-lived and produced no children. They held transient jobs, kept to themselves, and most tellingly, they began to find each other. It started with letters, sent to old caseworkers under false pretenses, seeking addresses. Then, whispered long-distance phone calls. They were drawn together not by familial affection, as the outside world knows it, but by a shared, unspoken understanding that they were exiles from a stolen kingdom, under the quiet leadership of Ezekiel Jr., who had managed to create a fragile, functional life as a night janitor. A new, smaller compound began to form, not in the Kentucky hollers, but on a secluded, scrub-filled property in rural Missouri, purchased with their pooled, meager savings. They did not practice the horrors of their ancestors. The physical rituals were gone, but the doctrine remained, internalized and transformed. It became a story of persecution, a sacred text of their own victimhood. They saw themselves as the last guardians of a forbidden truth, their very existence a testament to a covenant the world had tried to erase. They lived as brothers and sisters, their relationships chaste but intensely codependent, a closed circle, protecting itself from a world they still believed was out to corrupt them. The legacy of the Blackwood family was not just in the court transcripts or the whispered local legends. It was in this the uncanny ability of a twisted ideology to replicate itself, even in the absence of its original architect. The children of Delila May never had children of their own. The direct cursed bloodline ended with them. But the psychological inheritance, the shape of their fear and their isolation, was passed down perfectly intact. They proved that a family can be a fortress long after the original battle is over, and that the most durable prisons are not made of wood and stone, but of memory and faith. Twisted into chains, the truth did claw its way to the surface, just as it always does. But sometimes, when it emerges, it no longer looks like a person or a story. Sometimes, it just looks like a quiet, barren piece of land in Missouri, where a few old, broken souls live out their days, still waiting for a judgment that already came for them, long before they were even born. The Missouri property became a different kind of fortress. Where the Kentucky compound had been built of rough-hewn logs and physical isolation, this new refuge was constructed from silence and bureaucratic anonymity. Ezekiel Jr., who now went by the name Zeke Miller, became the patriarch of this fractured remnant. His leadership was not the fiery, prophetic command of his grandfather, but something quieter, more insidious. It was the stewardship of a sacred wound. They built a single, long, low-slung house, with rooms branching off a central hallway. A layout that echoed, perhaps unconsciously, the connected cabins of their birthplace. There were no chapters, no handwritten scriptures on the walls. The doctrine had been internalized, its rituals replaced by routine. Their days were marked by shared meals eaten in near silence, their evenings spent listening to the static hiss of a radio, forever tuned between stations as, if searching for a frequency only they could hear. Zeke had managed to secure a small pension for his disabilities, and the others took on work that required little interaction with the outside, as they called it. One brother bundled old newspapers for recycling in a dusty warehouse. Another sister, the one who had been Ruth, hand-assembled simple electronics in a factory, her deft, malformed fingers moving with a precision her speech would never achieve. They contributed their earnings to Zeke, who managed the household funds, with the solemnity of a high priest tending a temple treasury. Their relationship to the past was not one of mourning, but of curation. They did not speak of Delila May as a victim, nor of Ezekiel as a monster. In the private language of their shared solitude, they were the keepers of the line, the last repository of a sacred truth that the world had deemed too pure, too potent, to be allowed to exist. Their physical ailments were not genetic tragedies, but marks of the covenant, scars born from a spiritual battle their ancestors had waged. When one of them suffered when Ruth's eyesight failed further, or when another brother's heart began to beat with a ragged, irregular rhythm, Zeke would place a hand on their shoulder and say, "The world cannot understand the price of purity, but we do." The horror had been refined. It was no longer a raging fire, but a low, constant radiation, poisoning them from within. They were not perpetuating the physical crimes of their bloodline, but they were worshipping at its altar every day. They had become a living memorial to their own abuse, preserving the ideology that had created them by treating its consequences as holy relics. The outside world, in the form of a diligent county social worker named Brenda Walsh, would occasionally pierce their solitude. She saw a group of reclusive, disabled siblings caring for one another and initially filed them as a success story, a testament to resilience. But over her yearly visits, a deep unease settled in her gut. It was the silence. It wasn't the silence of contentment or even of trauma. It was the silence of a sealed tomb. She noted in her file that they never had photos, never spoke of childhood memories, never expressed a desire for anything beyond their fence line. Their cohesion, she wrote, feels less like family and more like a shared trance. In the winter of 1978, Ruth, now in her 60s, fell gravely ill with pneumonia. Zeke refused to take her to a hospital, insisting they could care for her themselves. It was Brenda, making an unscheduled visit after the postman reported no one collecting mail for a week, who found Ruth feverish and struggling for breath. She forced the issue, calling an ambulance at the hospital. Under the influence of fever and powerful antibiotics, Ruth's fortified mind began to crumble. She clutched at Brenda's arm, her one good eye wide with terror. She didn't speak of illness or doctors. She began reciting, in the same hollow tone Delila May must have used decades before, the twisted verses of the pure Doctrine. She called Brenda the outsider poison and begged for the vessel to be kept safe. Brenda sat with her for hours, listening to the fractured theology spill out. It was then she understood. The nightmare hadn't ended in the Kentucky mountains. It had simply packed its bags and moved. The state had saved the Blackwood children's bodies, but it had failed to reach their minds. They had carried their prison with them. Ruth survived the pneumonia, but returned to the Missouri house, a more broken woman. Zeke, however, saw her recovery not as a victory of modern medicine, but as a divine test they had endured. Their isolation deepened. Brenda's subsequent visits were met at the door by Zeke, his body a barrier, his mismatched ease a perfect mirror of his mother's holding a cold fire. "We care for our own," he would say. A statement that was both a fact and a scripture. The Blackwood story, it turned out, had multiple endings. There was the legal ending, written in court documents from 1920. There was the genetic ending, as the direct bloodline faded into sterile silence. But there was also this, a psychological ending, stretched out over decades in a quiet Missouri field. It was an ending without climax or revelation, only the slow, inevitable dimming of a light that had been twisted from its very source. The truth had surfaced, yes, but sometimes the truth is not a key that unlocks a door. Sometimes it is simply the final, heavy stone laid upon a grave, ensuring that what is buried within will never again see the sun. The final stone was laid not with a ceremony, but with the quiet click of a door latch. After Ruth's illness, Zeke Miller reinforced the boundaries of their world, not with wood and nail, but with a profound and unassailable withdrawal. He ceased all non-essential communication, paying utilities through money orders and acquiring groceries through a delivery service from a town 30 miles away. Brenda Walsh's annual visits were met with the same scene: Zeke on the porch, a silent sentinel, accepting the box of groceries she brought as a form of tribute to a king who no longer desired his crown, but would not abdicate his throne. The house became a mausoleum for living people. The siblings moved through their days with the practiced, economic movements of ghosts haunting a familiar space. Their conversations dwindled to functional necessities: the faucet drips, or the truck needs oil. The pure doctrine no longer needed to be spoken. It had become the very air they breathed, the lens through which they saw their own slow decay. A cough was not a symptom of a failing body, but a reminder of the world's impurity trying to get in. Aching joints were not arthritis, but the physical weight of their sacred knowledge. Zeke was the last to go. He outlived Ruth by 2 years, and his final brother by 6 months. In his last days, the house was utterly silent, save for the wind whistling through a crack in the kitchen window. He spent his hours in a worn armchair, facing the front window, watching the long gravel driveway. He wasn't waiting for a visitor. He was standing watch, as his grandfather had, against the corruption of a world that had long since forgotten he existed. His body was discovered by the postal worker, who noticed the mail piling up for a week and called the sheriff. The investigation was brief. There was no evidence of foul play, only the profound neglect of a man who had spent a lifetime neglecting everything, including himself. The state, once again, was left to clean up the remains. The county clerk, tasked with sorting through the few personal effects, found little of note: faded clothes, a few chipped plates, a savings account book with a meager balance. But in a small, locked metal box, tucked beneath the floorboard in Zeke's room, she found the last testament of the Blackwood line. It was not a diary, nor a confession. It was a single, yellowed photograph of Delila May, her mismatched eyes staring out from a time before the light in them had been fully extinguished. On the back, in a shaky, spidery script that mirrored his grandfather's annotated Bible, Zeke had written a single line: "We kept the faith." The property was sold for back taxes. The new owners, a young couple from St. Louis, tore down the long, low-slung house, believing its damp and silence to be a simple case of disrepair. They built a bright modern home in its place, with large windows that let in the sun. They never knew what had happened on that land. They never felt the faint, residual chill that had nothing to do with the weather. For the true legacy of the Blackwoods was not the compound, nor the bloodline, nor even the twisted doctrine itself. It was the terrifying, absolute power of an idea that could outlive its creator, survive the destruction of its physical world, and sustain itself for decades on nothing but its own poisonous logic. It was the blueprint for a prison that required no walls, a sentence passed down through generations without a judge or jury. The ghosts of eastern Kentucky did not haunt the hollers. They were not the mist on the ridge lines, or the whispers in the pines. The only ghost was the one they had become, a story of how a family, in the name of purity, had meticulously dismantled its own humanity, piece by piece, until nothing was left but the echo of a door closing, and the profound, unsettling silence that followed. The truth had finally finished clawing its way to the surface, and it had found, at long last, nothing left to say. Blackwood story. Years turned into decades. The new family on the Missouri land planted a garden where the long, low-slung house had stood. Children played in the yard, their laughter a sound the soil had not known in a century of sorrow. The geographic scar healed over, buried under clover and the mundane rhythms of a normal life. The Blackwood name, where it was remembered at all, was a footnote in a dusty archive, a bizarre and tragic case study in Appalachian folklore. But an idea, once given form, is a tenacious thing. It does not die. It fragments. It settles into the cracks of the world, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. In a university library, a graduate student in sociology named Liam stumbled upon the Blackwood case while researching cult mentalities in isolated communities. He was not haunted by the horror of the inbreeding or the abuse. He was captivated by the psychological mechanics of the pure doctrine. He saw in Ezekiel Blackwood not a monster, but a grimly brilliant architect of a closed belief system. In his thesis, he argued that the family was a perfect, if extreme, example of a self-sealing logic loop, impervious to external reality. His work was well received, a clinical dissection of a historical tragedy. But Liam, in his deep immersion, began to see echoes of the Blackwood isolation everywhere, in the polarized rhetoric of politics, in the insularity of online communities that preached their own forms of purity and exclusion. He started a blog, then a podcast, called Echoes in the Hollow, using the Blackwood story as a foundational parable. His audience grew, a community of the disillusioned who saw in his analysis a key to understanding a world they felt was corrupt and compromising, without ever meaning to. Liam had become a preacher, not of blood purity, but of ideological purism. He spoke of maintaining intellectual integrity and resisting the dilution of principle. His followers, who called themselves keepers, in a chilling, unconscious echo, built their own digital compound, a walled garden where their shared certainty was the only currency. They didn't burn with Ezekiel's religious fire, but with the cold, sleek conviction of being the enlightened few, and in a small town, hundreds of miles from either Kentucky or Missouri, an elderly woman named Anya sometimes experienced a strange, unplaceable dread. She was the granddaughter of the forest ranger, Thomas Mitchell, the man who had first discovered the compound. She had grown up with the story as a dark family legend, a tale her grandfather would tell only once in a great while, his voice heavy with a burden he could never fully articulate. This dread would come over her on certain still afternoons, or when she witnessed a particular kind of unyielding, self-righteous certainty in someone's eyes. She called it the holler feeling, a sense of doors closing, of minds sealing shut against the light. She couldn't explain it, but she knew it was the residue of the story her grandfather had carried. The truth had not just clawed its way to the surface. It had become a specter, a shape of warning passed down through bloodlines that had never even touched the Blackwoods. So, the story ends, not with a death, but with a transformation. The physical line of Delila May was extinguished, its final breath a silent exhalation in a Missouri chair. But the pattern, the blueprint of the fortress, survived. It was no longer written on cabin walls or preached in root cellars. It was encoded now in academic papers, in digital algorithms that curated reality, in the quiet, human tendency to build walls between us and them. The horror of the Blackwoods was never about the location, or even the specific doctrine. It was about the architecture of the soul, a design that could be replicated long after the original builders were dust. The ridgelines of eastern Kentucky still stand, and the morning mist still clings to them like ghosts. But the real ghost never lived there. It was the capacity for isolation, for self-willed damnation in the name of purity. And that ghost, the story whispers, in its final, fading breath, does not haunt a place. It waits, patient and perpetual, for a home in the human heart. In the quiet hum of the digital age, the ghost found new hollows to inhabit. Liam's podcast, Echoes in the Hollow, grew from an academic curiosity into a cultural touchstone. His listeners weren't mountain folk. They were urbanites and suburbanites, feeling untethered and adrift in a complex world. They found solace in Liam's clean, logical deconstruction of the Blackwood saga. He had given them a vocabulary for their own unease, cognitive isolation, doctrinal purity, the self-sealing narrative. Without realizing it, Liam began to change. The measured academic was replaced by a charismatic, if cynical, visionary. He started hosting live-streamed reasonings, where he and his inner circle would dissect current events through the lens of the Blackwood parable. To question Liam's analysis was not to disagree. It was to show one's own contamination by mainstream narratives. His digital compound had its own pure doctrine, one of unassailable logic and intellectual superiority. They were keeping the faith, not in God, but in their own rightness, a world away. In a sunlit university office, Anya Mitchell's granddaughter, Chloe, unearthed her great-grandfather's journal. She was a historian, and the personal account of Ranger Thomas Mitchell was a primary source of immense power. As she read his shaky handwriting, the description of the children's vacant eyes, the oppressive silence, the way Ezekiel Blackwood spoke of his own cruelty with the calm certainty of a prophet, she felt a shiver that was more than academic. She understood her grandmother's holler feeling for the first time. It was the chill of a closed system, a mind that has barricaded its own doors. Chloe decided to write a book, not just about the Blackwoods, but about the legacy of such stories. Her research led her, inevitably, to Liam's podcast. She listened with growing alarm. He was using her family's haunting, the very source of her grandmother's dread, as a foundational myth for his own insular community. He had sanitized the horror into an intellectual framework, but the underlying architecture was identical. We are the ones who see the truth. Everyone else is blind. She reached out to him for an interview, hoping to bridge the gap between the historical reality and his digital interpretation. Their conversation was cordial at first, a meeting of two experts. But when she mentioned the psychological devastation, the raw human cost that her great-grandfather had witnessed, Liam dismissed it. "That's the emotional surface, Chloe," he said, his voice smooth and condescending through her headphones. "I'm interested in the underlying structure. The family were victims, yes, but of a cognitive trap. My work is about helping people avoid those same traps." "But you're not helping them avoid it," she argued, a chill running down her spine. "You're building one yourself. Your keepers, your reasonings. You've just replaced the root cellar with a Discord server." There was a long silence on the line. When Liam spoke again, his voice had lost its professional sheen. It was colder, harder. "I see you're still operating from a place of emotional reasoning. You're too close to the story. You can't see the pattern for the pain." The line went dead. Chloe sat back, her heart pounding. He had used the exact same rhetorical move Ezekiel Blackwood had used on Delila May, reframing a normal human reaction: empathy, grief as a weakness, a flaw in her perception. The doctrine had replicated perfectly in a new host. The story of the Blackwoods, it seems, was never a story that could end. It was a warning without an expiration date. The cabin is gone, the bloodline is gone, but the hollow remains, an emptiness in the human spirit that is always ready to be filled. It echoes in the click of a keyboard, the algorithm that feeds us what we already believe, the comforting certainty that we are pure and they are poison. The truth did more than claw its way to the surface. It mutated. It learned to speak in a new tongue, to build with new materials. And it waits, not in the Kentucky mist, but in the glow of 1 billion screens, for the next family, the next community, the next generation, to decide that their truth is the only one that matters, and to begin, brick by digital brick, building their own fortress in the hollow, in the glow of her laptop. Chloe understood the battle had not been won in the Missouri field. It had simply changed theaters. The confrontation with Liam was not a conclusion. It was a reconnaissance. She had seen the enemy, and the enemy was not a man, but a meme, an idea so virulent it could disguise itself as enlightenment. Her book, when she wrote it, would not be a dry historical account. It became a polemic, a warning flare titled "The Hollow: How Isolation Poisons the Soul." She dedicated it to her great-grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, and to all the watchers at the gate, those who felt the chilling draft from sealed rooms, both physical and digital. She didn't just present the Blackwood facts. She meticulously drew a line from Ezekiel's fire and brimstone sermons to Liam's sleek, algorithmic dogmatism. She showed how the same psychological levers the creation of an in-group, the designation of a corrupting other, the reframing of doubt as sin were being pulled in broad daylight. The publication was a stone thrown into a still pond. It created a small but significant rift in Liam's digital kingdom. Some of his followers, the ones clinging to the edges of his community, read Chloe's work and felt a jolt of recognition. They saw the parallels between the pure doctrine and Liam's increasingly rigid principles of reason. They began to ask questions in the reasonings, questions that were no longer about refining the logic, but about challenging its fundamental humanity. Liam's response was swift and predictable. He devoted an entire episode to deconstructing the sentimentalists' attack on truth. He didn't mention Chloe by name, referring to her only as the grief historian, but his followers knew. He spoke of emotional contaminants and the need for ideological quarantine. That week, the moderators in his server were busier than ever, purging members who expressed even mild sympathy for Chloe's perspective. The fortress walls grew higher, the gates slammed shut more firmly. The community, purged of its doubters, became smaller, harder, and more fervent in its beliefs. Chloe watched this happen with a heavy heart. She had not stopped him. She had only refined him. By providing a clear, external enemy, she had given his movement a focus, a reason to tighten its ranks. She received emails, some thanking her for the clarity, others accusing her of being a paid agent of the mainstream narrative. She had become the outsider poison in their modern-day parable. Yet, in the silence after the storm, a different kind of echo began. A high school teacher in Ohio, who had read Chloe's book, started a unit on critical thinking, using the Blackwood story as a central case study. Her students, instead of just analyzing the past, were tasked with identifying closed systems in their own lives, from cliques at school to the influencer cultures they followed online. They were learning to recognize the holler feeling in its earliest, most subtle forms. A community center in rural Vermont, founded by descendants of isolated logging families, began hosting discussions on mental health and reintegration, using Chloe's historical research to understand their own legacy of silence. The ghost was not exorcised. It likely never would be. But the immune system was learning. The story of the Blackwoods was no longer just a secret whispered in the dark or a blueprint for building prisons. It was becoming a vaccine, a small, controlled dose of the poison, administered not to infect, but to inoculate. The final truth that clawed its way to the surface was this: the hollow is not a place you can burn down or fence off. It is a potential space inside every family, every community, every mind. The battle is not to destroy it, for that is impossible. The battle is to never stop letting the light in, to never stop listening for the wind in the pines, and to always, always be brave enough to question the doctrine, no matter how sacred it claims to be. For the moment you stop, the floorboards begin to creak again under the weight of new secrets, and the wind carries not an echo, but a beginning. The light, once invited in, proved difficult to extinguish. Chloe's book, and the conversations it sparked, became a low-grade antibody in the cultural bloodstream. It did not cure the disease of isolations. Such a thing is likely incurable, but it gave a name to the symptoms. The term holler feeling entered a certain lexicon, a shorthand for that instinctual chill one feels when witnessing a mind, or a community, deliberately closing its shutters. Liam's digital fortress, for all its fervor, began to suffer the fate of all closed systems. Entropy. Purged of dissenting voices, his reasonings became an echo chamber of escalating absurdity. Without an external world to push against, the internal logic grew increasingly baroque and fragile. Members began to leave, not in dramatic rebellions, but in quiet, weary disillusionment. They spoke of a creeping silence, a sense that they were no longer building anything, but merely tending a relic. The community, once so vibrant, slowly bled out, leaving behind a hardened core of true believers, whispering their pure doctrine to an ever-dwindling audience. The hollow had consumed its own. Years later, Chloe, now a tenured professor, was invited to give a lecture in a renovated community center in the very county where the Blackwood compound had once stood. It was part of a historical reconciliation project. She stood before a mixed audience, locals whose grandparents had whispered about the devil's daughter, academics, and curious outsiders. She did not lecture from notes. She simply told the story, from the first Josiah Blackwood to the last, silent days of Zeke Miller. She spoke of Delila May not as a monster or a myth, but as a girl who never had a chance. After her talk, an elderly man with weathered hands and eyes the color of the Kentucky sky approached her. He introduced himself as Arlen, and his family had lived in these hills for generations. "I remember my pappy talkin'," he said, his voice a soft gravel. "Said he saw one of the Blackwood young'uns once, back when they was bringing him out. Said the child just looked, lost, like a bird that fell from the nest too soon. We all thought the story died when that Missouri house fell down." "It didn't die," Chloe replied gently. "It just changed shape. The story was never really about this place. It was about the walls we built." Arlen nodded slowly, looking out the window at the ancient, unblinking ridgelines. "We got a saying here," he said. "A shadow can't live in a well-lit room. For a long time, we kept this story in the dark. Let it fester. Maybe talking about it, like you're doing, is just a way of lighting a lamp." That was the final, quiet evolution of the truth. It was no longer a secret clawing its way up, nor a weapon in an ideological war, nor even just a vaccine. It had become a lesson, a cautionary tale told not to terrify, but to illuminate. It was a story that acknowledged the human hunger for belonging and the terrible price of finding it in a fortress. The ghost of the Blackwoods, then, is not a malevolent spirit seeking vengeance. It is a teacher. Its classroom is wherever people gather. Its curriculum is a single, recurring question. Will you build a bridge or a wall? Will you listen for the echo in the hollow and recognize it as a warning, or will you mistake it for a call to come home? The ridgelines of eastern Kentucky remain, as they have for millennia. The mist still gathers in the hollers at dawn, but now, when the wind cuts through the pines just right, it doesn't only carry the echoes of a forgotten sin. It carries the murmur of a story being told, a lamp being lit, a quiet, enduring refusal to let the shadows win. And in that refusal, there is a victory, not absolute, not final, but profound. The floorboards have finally stopped creaking. The victory was not in a single, dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small, quiet acts of light. Arlen, the old man from the holler, began to speak more openly to his grandchildren. He didn't just tell them ghost stories. He told them the story of Delila May, framing it not as a local legend of a devil's daughter, but as a tragedy of a girl failed by her family, her community, and the very walls built to protect her. The tale, stripped of its superstition, became a lesson in empathy, a stark reminder of what happens when care turns to control, and faith curdles into fanaticism. Chloe's work, meanwhile, found its way into unexpected places. A playwright adapted it into a stage production that explored the story, not through graphic horror, but through the chilling poetry of its psychological isolation. Audiences didn't leave screaming. They left in a reflective, somber silence, checking in on their own relationships, questioning the subtle walls in their own lives. The hollow, as a concept, was mapped. Psychologists began using it to describe the clinical profile of individuals and families, trapped in self-reinforcing systems of belief. Social scientists studied online communities, not to condemn them, but to understand the points where healthy belonging tipped into destructive isolation. Using the Blackwood parable as their North Star, even the land itself seemed to respond. The new family in Missouri, who had built their bright home, eventually learned the history of their property from a passing historian. Instead of being dismayed, they felt a sense of solemn responsibility. They planted a simple grove of native dogwood trees at the edge of their property, not as a memorial to the Blackwoods, but as a living testament to resilience and renewal. It was a place for their children to play, a symbol that life, in all its messy, interconnected beauty, could and did reclaim even the most poisoned ground. The story never achieved a neat, happy ending. How could it? The pain was too real, the damage too deep. Liam's digital remnant still existed, a tiny, bitter asteroid of a community orbiting a sun of its own making, completely irrelevant to the wider world. The potential for another hollow would always exist, a permanent fixture of the human heart's geography. But the balance had shifted. The legacy was no longer defined by the silence of the victims or the certainty of the abusers. It was now carried by the teachers, the artists, the historians, the grandparents, and the neighbors who chose to turn on the lights. The truth had completed its long, painful journey. It had been a secret, then a weapon, then a vaccine, and finally, a tool. A tool for understanding, for recognition, for prevention. So, if you find yourself in a quiet moment, listening to the wind, and you feel that familiar chill-the-holler feeling, you now know what it is. It is not a ghost. It is a choice. It is the ancient, skeletal blueprint of a fortress, waiting to be built. And you hold the other blueprint in your hands. The one for a bridge, for a window, for a lamp. The echo in the hollow is not a command. It is a question. And for the first time in a very, very long time, enough people are finally beginning to answer. They are answering with stories, with empathy, with light. And in that collective, quiet response, the echo, at long last, begins to fade, replaced by the enduring, ordinary, and miraculous sound of humanin, the gentle decay of an old farmhouse at the edge of a forgotten field. The last physical remnant of the Blackwood story was slowly returning to the earth. It was a single, warped plank of chestnut wood, salvaged by a curious soul from the Missouri property before the new house was built. It sat in a barn, unmarked, its history known only to the historian who had placed it there, a silent witness waiting for its final task. This historian, a man named Ben who had corresponded with Chloe, saw the story not as a chain of events, but as a cycle. He understood that lessons, no matter how profound, fade with generations. The memory of the holler feeling would soften. The specific details of Delila May and Ezekiel would blur into the amorphous mass of old, sad stories. The immune system needed a booster. His project was simple, almost poetic. He took the plank, and from it, he carefully carved a series of small, smooth tokens. They were not ornate. They were not marked with names or dates. They were simply pieces of wood, warm to the touch, bearing the grain of a tree that had grown in the shadow of the original sin, and the nail scars from a prison it had helped build. He began sending them out, one by one. 2 people he believed were keepers of the balance, a teacher in a divided town, a moderator in a large online forum, a community leader in a neighborhood struggling with isolation. There was no instruction manual, only a small card with a single hand-printed line, for when you feel the walls closing in, remember the hollow. The tokens traveled. I sat on a teacher's desk, a paperweight holding down lesson plans about empathy and critical thinking. Another was carried in the pocket of a nurse who worked with traumatized families, her thumb often worrying its smooth surface during difficult moments. A third resided on the desk of a software engineer, a quiet reminder of the human cost of the algorithms he designed to connect people. They were not talismans. They held no magic. They were focal points, a physical object to ground a abstract, yet terrifyingly real, concept. When a person held one, they weren't holding a piece of the Blackwood's tragedy. They were holding a piece of the response to it. They were holding a fragment of the bridge, not the fortress. One day, a young woman, a blogger, who had once been a fervent follower of Liam's echoes, received a token in the mail. She had left the community years ago, scarred by the experience, and now wrote cautiously about the psychology of online belonging. She held the wood in her hand, and for the first time, she didn't think of Liam or his doctrine. She thought of Delila May, the real girl. She thought of the profound, simple loneliness that must have been at the core of it all. She didn't write a grand essay. She simply posted a picture of the token resting on her keyboard, with the caption, "A reminder, some walls are built to keep the light out. Our job is to be the light." The story had finally, truly, escaped its own narrative prison. It was no longer a historical case study, a podcast, or a book. It had become a part of the atmosphere, a shared, silent understanding passed hand to hand, a quiet agreement, written not in words, but in the simple, enduring act of remembering, and in the conscious, daily choice to build something kinder. The wind no longer carries an echo. It carries this agreement, and in the silent spaces between its gusts, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the sound of a new story being written, one connection, one act of understanding, one small, carved piece of wood at a time. The hollow is still there, but now, it is forever filled with light.